Ladies and gentlemen, if you begin making your way to your seats, we will begin promptly at 40.
All right, everybody, we're about to start, so if you could please take a seat. Chuck, we'll start in like 1 minute if you're good with that. All right. We're live right now? We're recording right now? All right. All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's panel discussion on the topic of security force assistance, past, present, and future. My name is Kyle Atwell. I'm a faculty member here in the Social Sciences Department, and also the founder and co-director of the Irregular Warfare Initiative. This event is a collaborative event between the Department of Social Sciences International Affairs Forum, led by the Venerable Captain Tony Palokarin, and the Irregular Warfare Initiative, which is a joint venture between the Princeton Empirical Studies of Conflict Project and the Modern War Institute, based out of here at West Point. Tonight's event is hybrid. We're pleased to welcome both our in-person participants here at the West Point Club at the United States Military Academy, as well as our virtual audience, which is dialed in from locations around the world. We have an exceptional panel and a short 1 hour for the conversation and follow-on question and answer portion of the event, so I'll keep my comments short. I just wanted to spend a few minutes to talk about what the Irregular Warfare Initiative is. We're an all-volunteer organization with the mission of bridging the gap between scholars and practitioners to support the community of irregular warfare professionals, and we do this through 3 different pillars. First, we generate original content on irregular warfare. This includes both audio content through the Irregular Warfare podcast, which you can listen to and download on any mainstream podcasting website. We also have written content through guest submissions, which you can also submit through. Second, we provide engagement events for the irregular warfare community, such as this one. We also had the annual conference on 9 to 10 September this year. And third, we have a non-resident fellows program, which is actually directed and led by Dr. Franky Matisek, who's one of our panelists today. The application deadline for the 2022 non-resident cohort is going to be December 3rd. All right, I'll pass on to the moderator for tonight's conversation, Dr. Max Margulies. So Max is the research director at the Modern War Institute at West Point, and before that was an assistant professor in the Social Sciences Department. He's been a good personal mentor to me as I was considering applying to PhD programs, and now that I'm dissertating, which I'm told is actually a word. He's also an exemplary example of bridging the gap between scholars and practitioners as a scholar himself, working here at West Point. So once again, thank you everybody for coming tonight. Enjoy the conversation, and without further ado, here is Max Margulies.
Thanks, Kyle, and thanks so much for organizing this wonderful event. I'm really happy to be here. We're going to have a great conversation with 3 awesome panelists. I've asked them to try to keep their answers brief, although my first question probably will make that a little difficult because we really want to save time for question and answers from from you, the audience, both those of you who are here with us in person and those of you who are joining us virtually. So without further ado, I will just introduce each panelist, and then I will go into my first question. So sitting immediately next to me, we have Major General Scott A. Jackson, who currently serves as Commanding General for Security Forces Assistance Command. He has a bachelor's degree from Notre Dame, 2 master's degrees, and over 30 years of service in the United States Army, including a cumulative 41 months of deployments in Iraq. 51. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Next to him, we have Dr. Renanah Miles Joyce. She's a postdoctoral fellow in Grand Strategy, Security, and Statecraft, appointed jointly at the Harvard Kennedy School's International Security Program and MIT's Security Studies Program. Next fall, she will be beginning as an assistant professor of politics at Brandeis University, and she's currently working on a book that examines the effectiveness of security assistance. And lastly, we have Lieutenant Colonel Jahara Franky Matisek, an associate professor in the Military and Strategic Studies Department at the United States Air Force Academy. He's also a senior fellow for the Homeland Defense Institute and director of fellows for the Irregular Warfare Initiative. He has a PhD in political science from Northwestern University. So thank you all for joining us. I would like to start with the simple question of, what do you see as the most appropriate goal or goals for security force assistance, and how well do those line up with security force assistance as we actually see it practiced?
Sequence then. Well, hey, first off, thanks for coming, everybody, and thanks for your interest. And I'll tell you, I'm sure you hear this all the time, but also thanks for what you're doing today, right? And continuing to serve your nation in this capacity. Before I get to Max's question, I'll just share with you, I appreciate your interest here tonight because this is your future, right? Security force assistance and competition, if you will, is what you are going to be about in the next decade, forever how long you serve. When I joined the Army and when I started school in 1986, it was still in the Cold War. That is the paradigm I grew up in. This is the new one, right? That paradigm shaped our Army then. This paradigm will shape the Army in the future. So again, I appreciate your interest tonight. So to go to Max's question, how does SFA shape the environment? It's just that it is going to be what you will do in the future will be one of our primary tools to achieve the nation's interests and objectives, right? So how does a nation achieve what it wants, right? It's got the elements of national power, obviously the diplomatic, information, military, and economic levers that it can apply. You represent the M, right? And in tomorrow's future environment, it could be pretty important. Short of war, I put that big disclaimer in there, right? Operations short of conflict. What we're talking about tonight is what you're going to do and how America maintains its place in the world and achieves its national objectives.
All right, thank you. It is really a pleasure to be here with you all tonight. And I'm going to actually answer the question by trying to flip it around a little bit in a way that I think dovetails with General Jackson's comments and say, I think it's better to start by looking at U.S. foreign policy goals and then ask whether SFA is an appropriate tool for those goals, right? Looking across the different tools of national power. Because if your only tool is a hammer, or if you're only looking at good goals for a hammer, then everything is going to start looking like a nail. And so, right now, I think there's a risk of seeing a lot of nails when it comes to SFA, rather than looking at how that's integrated into sort of a broader grand strategy to achieve national objectives. And so I think once we reframe the question to ask whether SFA is an appropriate tool, then there's an important distinction between the question of whether it will work in a given situation and when it should be used. Right, because the decision to use security of force assistance is always going to depend on the costs, which can only be assessed relative to the goals, and the alternatives, right? So in any given situation, are there better policy tools available? And if the answer is no, then security force assistance may be the best tool, but we can't answer that unless we're considering all of the alternatives. And so, I'll also say, I think we need, one thing where we need more analysis is actually looking at the relative effectiveness of SFA towards different goals. So we've seen a lot of attention and focus on the ability of SFA to build militaries wholesale, the way the U.S. has attempted to do over the last 2 decades in Iraq and Afghanistan. But SFA is also used increasingly for goals such as enhancing deterrence, gaining access and influence with partner militaries. It could be that it's better suited to those goals. I certainly think that we're going to see more use of it towards those kinds of ends in an era of increased strategic competition. And so I don't think we have really good answers yet as to sort of the conditions under which this works best. But again, this sort of tells us we need to do more comparative analysis and start looking at these different objectives in comparison to one another rather than in isolation.
Security force assistance. We should really, we can distill it down to, it really is about making foreign militaries more effective. When the U.S. interacts with another military, our primary goal should be making them more effective. Now, this is the fun part. What does it mean to make them more effective? It depends on the ability and capability of your partner. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. And when I say more effective, that can also be however you want to define it, because many of you at some point, formally or informally, will interact with somebody from another military. You should want them to be more effective. Unless, of course, like they're from China or Russia, but that's another discussion. But if it means you're in Senegal, and I've been to Senegal, and I've interviewed dozens of military officers in Senegal, interacting and talking with them, it is about what can you do to help them have better civil-military relations, but also deal with their civil war that you probably weren't aware of until just right now, so you're about to Google it on Wikipedia, et cetera. The Casamance conflict that's been going on since the early 1980s, how they can better handle that and not violate international laws and human rights. It's no different if you go to Taiwan. What can you do in Taiwan to make sure that the Chinese look at the Taiwanese military and be like, that's not worth it? So to me, that's shaping the environment. It could be West Africa, East Africa, anywhere in Asia. It could be in Eastern Europe. I was just in the Baltics. Guess what? Everybody in the Baltics and also Ukraine wants US troops there, teaching them how to be more effective. It's up to you and anyone else that is listening in to make them more effective.
Great. So I want to build on this idea that we're touching on now about security force assistance as not necessarily always the most appropriate tool, and also as a tool that should be, whose goal should be effectiveness. Is the military too tactically and operationally focused to build effective foreign partners at a strategic and policy level? Is that a problem with how we, the United States, do security force assistance? That our military, the key tool we use to do SFA, is it too tactically focused?
If I could jump in on that one, I'll probably just use some vignettes, right? So the short answer is I would say is no, right? It's not inappropriate, right? When you enter a relationship, you got to bring something to the table, right? And SFA and integrated deterrence, competition, whatever term you want to use, is about a relationship. And so what do you bring to the table? Well, with respect to the M and with respect to the United States military, we bring great skills, right? Skills that are in demand by our partners, presumably, right? So although it may not be transferring those skills to our partners may not be the bottom line interest or objective in our relationship, it is the currency in which we'll exchange back and forth to develop that relationship, right? It's the ticket to the show, right? Your promise, your ability to make them better is what brings them to the table and starts that relationship. It's what gives you presence, access, and then subsequent influence, right? So whether or not you can go to Djibouti and train a 450-man formation called the RIB, Rapid Intervention Battalion, in basic infantry skills, that's really secondary to the national interest of the United States. What's relevant to the United States is the fact that we now have a great, solid relationship with the Djiboutians. Why? Because I have 32 soldiers in Djibouti living with the Djiboutians every single day, training them how to be a good infantry battalion. And because of that relationship, our ambassador, our military leaders, our other interagency leaders can go to their Djiboutian counterparts and have a discussion. Okay, that's where I think the value of tactical actions. I always say, in SFA or in our world, tactical actions have strategic impacts, right? It's what gets you to the table, and in which you further that discussion. We can talk all sorts of time about other countries in the world, and for the sake of their relationships with their neighbors, I'll keep it kind of anecdotal, right? Where we have gone to places where the partner's got a sensitive relationship with respect to our two primary partner or antagonists, right? And they've said, hey, maintain a low profile. Please keep it down low. And we said, absolutely. 4 months into the mission, they have become so happy with the relationship. They now felt emboldened enough to tell those other two countries, hey, guess who's here? The United States, right? Publicly. So they've gone from conceal to reveal. And basically, through SFA, you have changed your partner force's actions, right? You've emboldened them. You've made them more deterrent. You've made them more capable. And you've changed their behavior with respect to China and Russia. That's how tactical actions have strategic impacts.
So, I guess I would maybe propose two potential challenges or limitations, right, to this approach, right? And I think one of them is I do think that there's a challenge when you are trying to sort of thread the needle from strategic goals to operational or tactical advising on the ground. And in many of my my research, my interviews with advisors across different parts of the defense enterprise, this is kind of a common theme that comes up in conversations. Like, well, we're there, we're doing these operational things, we're doing these tactical things. We have a sense of what the strategic goals are, right? But we're not really sure how we sort of scale up from these tactical or operational relationships to the strategic political relationships where the kinds of decisions are being made that the United States often cares a lot about influencing. And so I think, and to some extent, it also depends on, well, what are we asking of advisors, right? So for a military advisor who's going to impart a tactical or operational skill or competency to a partner force, right, to make them more effective, as Colonel Matisek was saying, that may not, that's not necessarily their job to actually ensure that translates into the desired political outcome. But I think it's absolutely critical to recognize that you need that ultimate political outcome to be successful, depending on what the U.S. national objective is. And so, how do we get to that sort of wholer of government approach to ensure that happens? I think the other thing that I'll say too there's and we'll probably talk about the political problems inherent in security force assistance at some point over the course of this panel. But I also think that, increasingly U.S. military advisors are very savvy to the fact that politics matter. But I think there are still some questions about how they matter. And, when advisors are on the ground doing operational and tactical things, sometimes those things are sort of inherently political in ways that aren't necessarily apparent because they're not political in the U.S. context. Right. So, I'm fond of saying that I think there are a few things more political in many foreign militaries than supply chains and promotion practices. Right. Those things are logistics and human resource management is fairly technocratic in the U.S. military, but it's often deeply political in partner militaries. And so, again, I think that's a fine line for advisors to navigate in order to actually be effective in achieving strategic goals.
So I'm going to pick up on the political context. That actually means a lot. So a few years ago, I was in Ethiopia. I interviewed an Ethiopian general. This guy's like half my size and pokes me in the chest and says, "You Americans, you're the most powerful military in the world and you don't get us." He's like, "We are a political animal. You're a machine." And of course, he's telling me this, and I know his background. This guy killed hundreds of Derg regime communists in the 1980s. And he's telling me, when you engage with us, you need to be aware that politics always matter. I've been to Uganda. I've also interviewed tons of officers and generals in Uganda as well. They will tell you, you need to be politically aware when you deal with us. We're not partisan, but you need to be politically aware. And the reason why I say it is because, and I think this goes back to the politics issue, is we want to, in the U.S. military, engage every foreign military in a very apolitical fashion. We want it to be very businesslike and very logical and mechanical, again, like that Ethiopian general astutely pointed out, and he was right. And yet, the logic of a military, its promotions, the way they think about military effectiveness is a byproduct of the logic of their political system. And so if you're going to be engaging with the foreign military, you need to know their culture. You need to know their language. And I'm not saying you need to actually like really learn their language, but like at least be aware of the political context in which they operate, because the way you advise, mentor, engage with them is going to have a major impact on the way they absorb or don't absorb your training, advising, and assisting.
So I really like this emphasis that we're getting to on promotion policies and the politics of recruitment, organizational culture, things like that. General Jackson, I'm gonna direct this question initially to you, but then see what the others have to say. How can you talk a little bit about how security force assistant brigades are equipped or trained to engage in that element of the advising relationship that you emphasize? How equipped are they to with that cultural expertise?
Sure. So it starts with understanding their purpose, right? So the security force assistance brigades, or SFABs, as we'll call them for short, right? Mm-hmm. The Army's first attempt at a purpose-built formation to conduct at that time combat advising, right? And I'll skip you the long, arduous history lesson of how we did it over the last 15 years before that, but it wasn't good. It wasn't efficient, right? So SFABs were an attempt to fix those problems in the past. So let's just set that aside. If people ask me, hey, what makes the SFAB capable of doing what it does today? The answer is one word: it's people, right? And specifically defined as the right people. So it starts with, I have a simple phrase. It's, every good advisor is a good soldier, but not every good soldier is a good advisor, right? If you pull that play on words apart, there are some skill sets that you're seeing here today, here, throughout your time here at West Point, where you're learning tactical leadership and organizational leadership. Certain skill sets work great in a conventional formation, doing a blocking and tackling style mission, right? Trying to deal with partners for months on end, the art of negotiation, of indirect influence, understanding the larger political context or environmental context takes a different thought process, a different emotional intelligence, as we say. So, everybody here, I'm sure, understands the 7 Army values. Those are all still applicable. Okay, but I add 13 more to the mix of things that I'm looking for in a potential officer or non-commissioned officer in an SFAB. Why? Because you all represent the United States by yourself someplace in the world. And my greatest fear, when senior leaders get asked this question all the time, so what keeps you up at night, right? And you're supposed to give some big hoity-toity, philosophical answer. And what I tell them is it's the strategic serious incident report, right? And that means a single advisor doing something stupid, in a country somewhere in the world, bringing disgrace on America, because it'll have national impacts. It's that important. So to go to the question on the table is, we find the right leaders first off, right? We empower them with information and decision authority, right? We broaden their horizons through education and training. We routinely pull, for example, ambassadors into our training plans, right? How many captains in the United States Army get to do one-on-one engagements with former ambassadors or current ambassadors? Not many, except in my formation, right? Why? To broaden that emotional intelligence, build a foundation of experience so that they can make better decisions when they're forward deployed by themselves, right? So, and again, it's about maturity. It's about the right person with the right attributes and good training.
So if people and individual characteristics like that are so important in our Army when we're identifying trainers, that's also something that we have almost no control over, I would imagine, in the countries whose forces we're training. So that sounds like a challenge.
It is a challenge. I mean, you can't necessarily pick your partner at the individual level, right? But there are some who argue that if we're really going to make this work, then we need to be, knee deep in their business sometimes. And if you got a partner that's not working towards a common goal, then maybe that person needs to go, right? I did it personally in Afghanistan, right? I'd sit down with the Minister of Defense and go down to the battalion XO level, right? Down to the major at the individual battalions and say, Ellen, no good. He needs to be fired, right? Lamoth, good. Promote him. That was a joke, by the way.
Unofficial.
You're not promoted. You're not,
I have
not
no
promoted.
role in Lamoth's capacity here at West Point. But my point is, when you develop a solid enough relationship based on credibility and stature, you can have those kinds of discussions to make for good partners. But you just can't do that on day one. So we don't do that on day one. But you also just have to work with what you got. Right. I had a partner in Afghanistan, an Afghan 3-star general, very old school, taught by the Russians back in the 80s and 90s. Right. He still thought like a Russian. Right. Very centralistic, wouldn't empower anybody. And I worked every single day to try to break that cultural mentality and some other issues we had with them too. And eventually we got him moved out, right? Who replaced him? A young lieutenant general who, by the way, grew up in the special operations ranks, mentored at an early age by other U.S. Army Special Operations Forces leaders, right? Had a totally different outlook on life. And so again, through a little bit of mentorship, a little bit of talent management, you can kind of cultivate the force that you want to try to develop.
Thank you. Dr. Joyce or Colonel Matisek, what do you, do you have any points of agreement or disagreement on this role of how easy it is or what the challenges are for us to influence these personnel decisions in partner forces?
So, I guess I would just add maybe one thought there. I think that's hard to do. Specifically if we're talking about influencing personnel decisions in partner forces, right? Particularly depending on the nature of the SFA mission, right? When we look at this recommendation to sort of be very intrusive and involved in partner forces, in promotion practices, really assumes that the U.S. is going to have an unusual degree of access and control over those militaries, and that's probably only going to happen in sort of moments of sort of wholesale army building, for example, the kind that we see quite rarely. When you're going in and engaging with a military that's already established, that already has fairly robust institutions of its own, I think you're going to see it's going to be harder to gain entry there. That said, I do think that the U.S. can do better at sort of championing better partners and sort of recognizing that states aren't unitary actors, neither are military organizations, and within these organizations, there are going to be some people who are more closely aligned with U.S. interests, who maybe are more likely to share sort of common values or objectives, and then maybe finding ways to help support or champion those people, right? And so really focusing on more targeted relationship building rather than what I think we see kind of today tends to be more of a diffuse scattershot. Well, we'll just try to build relationships with everyone, and hopefully some of them will work and some of them will pan out, and eventually some people will rise to the top, and then we'll have an ally like in the Ministry of Defense. Or in the Minister of Defense. And so I do think that there are opportunities to sort of be more selective in the relationships that are cultivated, even in situations where you can't necessarily, dictate how a sovereign partner arranges their personnel or promotion practices.
Yeah, I don't disagree. The example I used, just to keep it in context, right? That was Afghanistan, right? That's not Colombia. That's not Thailand. That's not Jordan, right? Totally different, so keep everything in context. Now, what I would argue, though, is on the positive side, though, you may not be able to fire somebody, but you can enhance somebody, right? So I see, one foreign student here, right? Are there any other foreign students, right? There you go. Case in point, IMED, right? We use it all over the world as a chance to enhance the capacity and to develop leaders in those formations. Right? It's just one small capacity, right? So you're not tearing somebody down, you're building somebody up. Hopefully, right?
No, he's actually right. And that's something we were talking about just a few hours ago about in my field work in Africa, Middle East, and Asia. The number one thing I will encounter from any foreign military officer is how they want to get a work college spot in the U.S. because it's so coveted. It is the enhancing, like General Jackson said, for their career, but also for the professional networks. And oh, by the way, that is a big thing for the U.S. military. So when the coup stuff happened in Egypt a few years, it was almost like
10 years ago.
Yeah, it was almost 10 years ago.
Morsi was 2013.
Yeah, man. The fact that, you had generals emailing everybody on the Joint Staff saying, hey, do you remember going to college at the War College with the new president of Egypt, because he was a War College graduate, because they wanted to get comms, a backdoor discussion going with like, okay, what's going on? Is this really, is this really going to happen? And the reason why I bring this up is because that is something that the U.S., as much as we like to pick on ourselves and think we're failing every which way, the fact that every single foreign military officer I meet always makes a comment about like how they would love to go, like they'd love to have their kid go to West Point. I know it sucks. I'm an Air Force Academy guy, and they're like, I don't care about that. I want them to go to West Point. But they'll make comments like that about wanting their kid, or if they're like a junior officer, about wanting to get a War College spot. Now, I will say, and this is the importance of knowing the culture and also having some sort of emotional intelligence. I was fascinated by the number of African officers I've interviewed. So I've been all over Africa, and they'll make comments about like, if you get them to open up a little bit, they would tell you things like, well, yes, you Americans, you understand a strategy really well, but when we want to send our best and brightest to like infantry school or specialty schools, we want to send them to the UK and France because the Brits and the French know how to fight the way we do. And why do I say that? Because when I dig a little deeper, what do you mean the French or Brits are better than us at infantry fighting or other things like that? And they're like, well, you Americans, you have all your technology, and you have your GPS, you have your SATCOM phones, you have all this technology in the field. We're your average African country. We don't have the money or the resources to fight the way you do. The Brits and the French are willing to teach us to fight that way because that's the resources they expect to have in the field. If they have the extra ISR, et cetera, that's fantastic. But they assume they will not have that. And that's why the average country over there would rather get that experience. And so if you want to be an effective advisor, it's going to these countries, knowing what they can actually do and teaching them to that standard and making them excellent, as opposed to saying, well, here's your cell phone, here's your GPS, here's your government travel card, let's go to the nice hotel, and that's how we're going to do business, and that's how we're going to fight. And it's like, no, it doesn't work like that. So just being aware of that emotional intelligence, dealing with a foreign military, is that they don't have the resources that we do in the U.S. military.
What I really like about that point is we've talked a bit about how our partners in security force assistance don't always share our interests, but that really highlights that even if they share our interests, the problems don't end there. They might not have our resources. So really great point. Thank you. My next question, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask, what is the role what role do we see for security force assistance in what was called great power competition and what we're now conceptualizing as strategic competition?
Okay, let's go the other
Yeah,
way.
sure, sounds
Not
good.
that it's a
yeah.
hard question.
No, I mean, it is a hard question because, and this is something that, again, we discussed a few hours ago, is the way we did competition during the Cold War, we had an explicit strategy. I'm not trying to indemnify any administration over the last decade or so, but we do not have an explicit strategy other than to influence and, do stuff out there, right? And I want more than that. And this is where I think as an American, I think for most people in this audience, when you think about America, what it represents, we're going to be having this really tough paradox of what it means to do influence, advising, cooperating with foreign militaries in an era where the Russians and Chinese are going to be much more explicit in the way they weaponize corruption, the way they are willing to break all norms and laws, et cetera, in the pursuit of raw power. And we, as the US and fellow NATO countries, we're not going to do that. And that's highly problematic because the Chinese and Russians know they can carve out a chunk of this world by virtue of exploiting our, I don't want to say our righteousness or our ivory tower views and beliefs, but, this is the paradox of I believe in our country, and I know everyone here who is here tonight believes in their country, whether or not you're American, but running into the problem of our values and the fact that we were willing to look the other way with some partners during the Cold War because it was meant to beat the Soviet Union. And now we're caught in the conundrum of, do we train, advise, and assist certain countries and partners and militias and militaries, et cetera, that do not share our values, but they share our national interest in countering China and Russia. And this, I think, is a really big moral issue that I don't think as a country we're willing to have that discussion or debate. But that has strategic implications.
So, all right. So I see several roles for SFA in an environment of great power or strategic competition. But first, for one thing, to Colonel Matisek's point about this idea of norms and values or breaking norms. So one thing I do think that we've seen since the Cold War that really gained a lot of energy at the end of the Cold War, the beginning of the unipolar moment, was actually this idea of using security force assistance as a way to impart norms and values in partner forces. And we really have seen a pretty major increase in programs, in training, in curricula that sort of augment these advising efforts that actually do try to impart those norms. And so, I think one takeaway from your comments is to say, there may be a window of opportunity here to try and ensure that those efforts don't sort of wilt or fade away in the face of strategic competition or pressure. And in fact, that maintaining an emphasis on imparting those norms might be a part of a strategy of competition. So in addition to that, I'll add just a few other roles that I see for SFA in great power competition. And one of them is, right, so major powers, nuclear armed powers, are less likely to, or they're going to try to avoid direct military conflict with each other because of the stakes of escalation, right? And so what we tend to see in those sort of intensifying periods of great power competition actually is sort of a increase in sort of gray zone or proxy conflicts as a means of competing indirectly while trying to manage the risks of escalation. And so, so I think as competition increases, there's good reason to think we're going to see higher levels of proxy conflicts proliferating, and that there may be a big role for security force assistance to try and train, advise, and equip friendly actors to help who are facing subversive tactics from, for example, Russia or China. And so actually that we might see an increased demand for SFA in those kinds of conflicts. I also think that we'll see sort of shifting goals for SFA, right? So over the last 20 years, we've seen a real emphasis on sort of counterterrorism missions and army building missions in sort of the weakest states, right? Trying to shore up really fragile partners. I think we're probably going to see a shift potentially away from that and towards maybe higher end partners looking at enhancing deterrent capabilities, for example, or going back to the Cold War, using SFA increasingly as a way to try and gain access and influence over partner forces. And I think we see some dynamics of that even in looking at, for example, the SFAB missions today, which are explicitly oriented around great power competition. And I think a third role that I see is in new domains like cyber and emerging technology. That there's really going to be an important role for SFA here. So for a couple of reasons. One, precisely to ensure that partners don't lag behind the U.S., right? As new technologies emerge and the U.S. military becomes more, reliant on them in its warfare, how do you make sure that your partners are actually able to operate with you effectively, are able to contribute to coalition warfare, right? That systems and platforms are interoperable. I think there's a role for SFA to play there, and on the other side of that coin is to ensure that partners have the ability to defend themselves against cyber warfare or against emerging technologies that are directed against them by mutual adversaries.
Thanks. So it's good going last because you can kind of fill in the gaps sometimes. So I would add to the discussion. So in an era where, money's going to get tighter, but risk is going to go up. And so I think we all understand the money's getting tighter part. My assessment is strategic risk goes up when you're dealing with 3 nuclear powered, entities all kind of, nudging for space in the world, right? Does it result in, thermonuclear war? Hopefully not, probably not, but it still could result in conflict. And so if risk is going up, physical resources are going down necessarily, you need something that's effective and efficient use of your national means to represent the United States and achieve our objectives and interests, right? And so my argument is that security force assistance writ large, encompassing all the programs available to us, represent a good return on investment, right? It's cheap compared to, large scale conventional force deployments of any service, right? It's pennies on the dollar, right? The return on investment, because it's low footprint, low visibility, is exceptionally high. I've already kind of given you some vignettes there. So again, I think it's good return on investment, cost effective. Crisis, right? So we're focusing on competition, which if you think about the spectrum of operations, the spectrum of conflict, right? So far one side, you have competition, right? Which is hopefully status quo. Hopefully we stay there. In the middle, or I should say on the other end, you've got conflict, right? Of various flavors and intensity. And in the middle, you have this period called crisis, which is a period of instability, unknown, what's going on. And it's a transition period, right? You go from competition to crisis, and hopefully through your actions, your decisions made by the national authorities, you can hopefully slide back into competition, de-escalate, right? If you make bad decisions in crisis, there's only one way to go. And it's to the bad side of the slide. It's to conflict, right? So my argument is this, is that if we do competition right, fully utilizing security force assistance programs, right, you have the chance to de-escalate. Why? Because you're in the environment, right? Your understanding of the environment's better. Your forward posture provides you options, right? Both blue options, U.S. options, as well as I would call green options, basically enabling or advising or facilitating the actions of your partner force. So again, I think we've all had this in our personal life, right? If something's going on in your life and you're not there, and if you don't have the information to make a decision, what are you probably going to do? Make a bad decision, right? So you need to get into space. And I think security force assistance is critical to getting us into space. And lastly, and Dr. Joyce kind of touched on this real briefly at the end, it is about interoperability. Because if we can't de-escalate from crisis back to competition and we go high order, right? Our national security strategy is very clear, right? It's about allies and partner, because nobody wants to fight alone, right? That is a traumatic event if we're fighting alone. So we want to fight with our partners. If you can't work alongside your partners, then it's harder than fighting without your partners, right? So you want them to be interoperable. We do that through training. We do that through procedures. And we do that through relationships, technical, procedural, human, 3 components of interoperability. All right, SFA addresses all 3 of those things. And so should we have to go to the far right-hand side of the slide and fight tomorrow, right? You want to have done the competition activities today to make tomorrow successful, right? Systems that can talk to each other, technical means, relationships that exist so that we know how to talk, different doctrines to Colonel Matisek's point, right? The British, 7 questions versus the US MDMP, right? The NATO STANAG model for planning advice, US MDMP, you get my points, right? And then here's the other piece, deterrence, right? So would you rather have an ally or a partner that is a beaver or a porcupine? Serious. If you're a bear and you're given a choice between attacking 2 animals, one of which is a beaver and one's a porcupine, which one are you going to attack? Which one? It's not a hard question, man. The beaver, right? Because the beaver's not going to hurt you unless it slaps you with the tail, right? But if you got a full-grown, fully quilled porcupine, you're going to think twice, even if you're a big old bear, all right? Our job is to create the porcupine, right? Make them more prickly, as I would say. Make them more deterrent, right? If you're a small country in the northeast part of Europe, living with one back against the water, facing forward against a threat to the east, right? Do you want to be a beaver or do you want to be a porcupine? You want to be a porcupine. And what's better than one porcupine? 2 porcupines. And so if I'm right alongside you, I talk in analogies all the time. You guys have to get used to it, right? If I'm right there beside you as an advisor, a combat capable formation, right? We've made a super porcupine to a degree, and we've changed the deterrence calculus, right? So again, maybe we drive crisis back to competition. That's why you do SFA today, and that's why it's so important in competition.
And I actually wanted to piggyback on General Jackson's point, and I'm going to throw the Air Force under the bus on this one. But 4 F-35s is basically $250 million. If we gave him 4 F-35s worth of resources and money, I can promise you, I mean, F-35 is kind of scary, but I can promise you, you can get a lot more porcupines, a lot more deterrence out of $250 million in your budget than we can with 4 F-35s. That won't fly if it's raining or the gas is too warm and other issues. And we're dealing with it, okay, folks? All right, we're dealing with it.
This has been such a wonderful conversation, and there are so many other ideas that you've brought up. I feel like I could talk to you about this all day, but we are already getting some questions rolling in virtually, so I'm going to transition to our audience Q&A portion of the evening. I believe a microphone will be going around this room, but while our live audience comes up with some questions, I'll start with the first question that we've gotten online from Zach Miller. Should security force assistance advisors stay in units longer to help meet the strategic goals over the long term? I think this is a really great question that builds on what we were all talking about throughout the evening about the importance of relationships.
I know where you're at, so once you start.
Well, I mean, so I'm pushing him. I want there to be a functional combatant command that does military assistance. It's a pretty radical idea, but the reason why I say that is because, fun fact, we have spent, and I say we, the U.S. military, U.S. government has spent $340+ billion on military assistance since 2000. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money. I don't think Stratcom or Transcom has spent that much money in the last 20 years. I want this to be the most effective enterprise. We should be able to easily beat the Chinese and Russia in this easily. There's no excuse for us not beating them because we're spending so much money doing this. And I'm passionate about this, and that's why I'm so happy to be here with everybody here, is the fact that we all believe that we can do this, we can do it better, we can be more efficient, and we can easily out-influence and out-compete the Chinese and Russians. But where does the rubber meet the road? And can we actually like follow through? And that's why I'm really, I want there to be an opportunity to go up the ranks. You know, once you've done your 5 to 10 years in your MOS or AFSC for the Air Force, for you to transition to being a full-time advisor, because knowing the politics of a partner military and their government and their society means so much in having that professional network, understanding how to work with them, how to get things done, who are the real power brokers. There's a joke in comparative politics about the former president. It was the president of Afghanistan. This is the formal and informal state of the fact that in Afghanistan, the president of Afghanistan was really just the mayor of Kabul. Why is that funny? Well, because in many of these countries that we are working with a government, you meet the elected leader of that country, and then you later find out, oh, you want to do XYZ in this country, or you want to you want to go patrol in this town, or you want to meet an elder. Oh, that person actually is much more powerful, has much more connections to get things done and help you, and also help the host nation military if needed be, because that's the actual informal power broker that actually gets things done in that society. And that's why, again, I want us to easily excel and kick China's and Russia's butt on this. And that's why I genuinely think that SFABs is a great step in the direction of us truly institutionalizing this across all the branches. And at some point, us hopefully having some type of command structure that makes sure that someone is held accountable and responsible for the 30 or 40 organizations that the U.S. has in country X, be it contractors, SOF, Army, Air Force, Embassy, etc., that are working with a partner military and government, that they can actually unify and do it coherently so it's not fragmented.
I'm going to add two quick thoughts on that, and I'm not going to opine on the historical fate or prospects of functional commands, although this is an intriguing idea. But I will make I think a plug for the SFABs here, and to say right that I do think, but I do think one of the things that they do is I think they do a couple of things. First of all, by having sort of an institutionalized role for advisors, particularly in the conventional forces, this does a couple of things. One, it provides a mechanism for persistent engagement over time as you have units continuously engaging with a partner country that helps to sort of counter some of this tyranny of shorter deployment cycles where relationships are sort of barely established and then they're broken and the cycle starts over and the cultural knowledge and the learning piece starts over. It also helped by having sort of an institutionalized advisory capacity. It also, I think, provides more opportunities to touch all levels of a military institution, from the strategic down to the tactical. And that's particularly important if you want to actually make long-term sort of transformative changes. Not an easy task, but it's certainly not going to happen if you end up cultivating what Colonel Matisek has called, enclaves of competence in some of his recent writing. So, and I will say, I do think one other thing though, and that you also touched on is, I think right now the U.S. has a lot more persistent engagement than it really recognizes or gets credit for because of how fragmented a lot of SFA activities are, right? I mean, Djibouti's come up in this conversation. By my count, there are currently, I think, up to 4 different sets of advisors from multiple U.S. government agencies, all working in Djiboutian military warehouses on logistical problems. Same problem set, same warehouses, 4 different sets of advisors coming in and out, right? So that's a lot of engagement, but is it fully integrated? I don't know. I'm not saying it isn't, but the coordination piece is a real problem. So where that's resolved, I don't know whether that's a functional command, whether that's yet another task for the overloaded country team, but that coordination needs to happen somewhere to really maximize the engagement that you're getting.
Yeah. Max, I'll really quick on
Go for it.
because I think I know who asked this question. Zach used to work for me, so I know he asked this question. So I take a slightly different perspective on it, right? And a disclaimer up front is that the answer I'm going to give you will not fit everybody within the SFA enterprise. It's more than just the SFABs, right? But here's what we bring. Here's what my calling card or my value card is to my partners. I'm an expert and I'm current, right? Technical competence, right? And I've already talked to the emotional intelligence, stuff like that. I fear a professional permanent advising corps because I lose technical currency, right? And so somebody who used to be a company commander 10 years ago, who knew how to do a armored company attack, all right, has lost touch with doctrine. He's lost touch with the state of the art and the trade craft, right? And he's just lost currency. And so that's why we have a personnel policy where we cycle folks in and out of the formation. They establish institutional longevity, if you will, based on repetitive assignments inside the organization. But they always go back to where you guys are going in a couple of years, the operating force, right? So that they are relevant at the discussion. So just different opinion. Okay.
Great. Thank you. I have a lot of thoughts, but I want to give our audience here a chance.
Thank you all for coming out. My name is Tristan Monahan, class of 2024. This question is going to be directed towards Colonel Matisek. So you touched upon how China and Russia sort of have grand strategies for how they're going to be competing with the U.S. and how the U.S. doesn't really have any right now. And so I was just wondering, besides the reforms of SFA that you touched upon, what do you think some of our parts of our grand strategy should look like?
Well, already, I mean, if you look at the most recent NDS, it's build a more lethal force, strengthen alliances, attract new partners, and reform the department for greater performance and affordability. I genuinely think that security assistance and cooperation with foreign militaries needs to be a pillar. Why does it need to be a pillar? Because then we actually promote people that excel at doing advising, training, and equipping. Why does that matter? If you want to excel in something, you promote people that excel in that. being an advisor is not easy. Like, at least in the Air Force, it killed me when my friends ended up doing advisor duties as air advisors for the Iraqis and Afghans, and it actually hurt their career. And that made no sense to me because I'm like, wait, you're working harder and you're not being rewarded for working harder. Like doing conventional war stuff, I don't know how it's an Army side. In the Air Force side, doing conventional war is easy. Doing advising and like other types of like irregular warfare, that's hard. Like as an Air Force guy, I have to actually get out of my 5-star hotel and like, get a little dirty and like have to put on my boots and stuff like that. And like, actually have to work at like a 6-hour day. Like, but like advising is not easy, but you can talk to an advisor and they love it and it's so rewarding. Right, sir? I mean, you talk to them and they just, like the relationships, the experience, the fun of it, but it's not easy. And if it's not easy and you have to learn the politics, you have to learn the culture, you have to understand the context of what you're operating in, that's why I want it to be a professional advising force. And we can have beers after and talk about how we would, make that work, or you can keep, re-blue or re-green yourself. I have some ideas on that, but I genuinely want America to kick ass at this. I really do.
So I'll follow up with another virtual question on this point that might push. I think we know how Colonel Matisek wants to redesign security force assistance. Sandor Fabian asks, does SFA seems to be the hammer here? So based on that, is it time to redesign the hammer? Should SFA content or processes be revised to better address Russian and Chinese threats?
So yeah, short answer is yes. Yeah, because we were talking about this all day today, right? So we've been doing this for a couple of decades now, but we've had a different tool set, right? So to use that, everybody loves the hammer and nail kind of thing, right? So we had a 16-ounce claw hammer for the last 2 decades, right? But now we have a pneumatic nailer, right? And if any of you walk into my garage and you grab my framing nailer off the wall and you start beating a nail in it, I'll punch you in the face, right? You need to know how to use the pneumatic nailer, right? It requires a compressor, it requires power, but it's so much more efficient, right? Would everybody agree with me? So we have a pneumatic nailer now, right? We're not doing the claw hammer thing anymore. I told you, I'm talking analogies, and if you have a problem with it, we're gonna have issues. Anyway, so that's where we're at today. We now have the pneumatic nailer. We got to change our processes. We got to change how we do money. We got to change how we do authorities. We got to change how we do planning, right? Colonel Matisek talked, and Dr. Joyce talked about persistent presence, for instance, right? We had a tool set in the last 2 decades built around, at least on the Army side, built around conventional brigade combat teams or brigades, right? We took them, we brought them from Iraq or Afghanistan, we brought them home, we reset them, we trained them a little bit. We said, hey, guess what? You're going to Africa. You're now the regionally aligned force for Africa, this infantry brigade, right? And over the course of the next 9 months, they would send, a platoon over to Africa for 2 weeks and they'd bring them home. And then we'd send a company over to Ethiopia to do justified accord for 3 weeks and then we'd bring them home, right? We were putting our finger in a puddle of water and then pulling it out and then expecting the water to hold the shape that our finger maintained, right? Not in the Navy, but I'm pretty sure that doesn't work, right? Go Army, beat Navy. So now we're not doing that. Now we're going there and we're bloop, and we're staying, right? Now to do that, you got to change the rules a little bit. And so I'm not saying we're, nobody's a bad guy out there, right? Nobody's fighting against this. We're figuring this stuff out every single day. But you got a new tool. You got to figure out how to use it. You got to understand the resources that's required to use it. So yeah, reform is required.
I'd add a couple of thoughts to that. And one thing is, in a lot of the interviews that I've been doing with policymakers and practitioners across the sort of SFA enterprise, a common theme that I hear is something along the lines of, well, we're aware of competitors, but we're not going to let Russia or China dictate U.S. foreign policy. Good, great, good sentiment. However, I think it's important to remember that rivals always get a vote too, right? And so the U.S. is rarely the only SFA provider in a given context. And, when the other providers are allies or like-minded partners who are all sort of pulling together towards the same goal, that's a great thing, right? That's burden sharing, that's force multiplying. But to the degree that rivals are providing SFA to the same partners, that the U.S. is likely to give more and get less in return. Particularly when the goal is to cultivate access or influence with partner forces. The presence of competition is going to pose a barrier, and I think that there needs to be, I think, some more dynamic thinking about what that interaction looks like. And just another quick thought, stepping back to this idea of grand strategy for the U.S. and what should that look like. I do think, we've talked a little bit about the DIME aspect, right? It's a diplomacy, information, military, and economic components of national power. And we're very much focused on the M piece right now, the M of the DIME. But I do think that it's really important to think about how that piece fits with the others and what some of the parallels and some of the differences are from the kind of competition that we saw before during the Cold War. So, for example, I'll just talk about the E for a few seconds, right? We saw really different economic dynamics in the Cold War than we do today. There was very little, U.S. partners and allies had very little economic dependence on the Soviet Union, right? Soviet Union was fairly isolated economically outside of the Soviet bloc. That's a completely different dynamic today, where even the closest U.S. allies in Asia, for example, their primary trading partner is China, right? And so how does that economic interdependence or dependence affect at a strategic level, the kinds of things that the U.S. is trying to achieve through the M of grand strategy or competition. And I think that's, I don't have good answers for that, but I think that's something that we sort of strategically need to be thinking about in the long term if we're looking at how to retool SFA as part of a grand strategy toolkit.
Remind me to poke each of you on this idea of persistent presence and grand strategy after the panel. I think we have a live question here in the back.
Sir, Cadet Luganzu Melissa, Company A1, Class of 23. I have a question for General Jackson. Given the recent fall of Afghanistan and Kabul, what do you think SFAB could have done better, both tactically and strategically, to prepare the Afghan army? And my second question is, can you kind of talk about the 13 values that you look for in an SFAB, NCO, and officer? Thank you.
So first lesson, anytime you throw a number out, somebody's going to call you on it. So just throw that one away for future reference when you become senior leader. Hey, so I'm glad you asked the question about Afghanistan because it's an important one, right? And again, keeping in mind the audience I'm talking to here today, right? The people you lead in a couple of years or a year or 3 years or 4 years, this is still going to be fresh and raw. So just keep that in mind, right? So what the U.S. military did for 20 years plus, okay, is nothing short of outstanding and amazing, all right? And I fully believe that. And I'm not patting myself on the back, right? It is truly amazing. Now, what we've talked about indirectly today and a little bit tonight as well is, okay, everybody has a hand at the oar, and it's not just Department of Defense, right? I mean, everybody in the United States, every aspect of the United States government has an oar in this boat to row, and everybody needs to look at how hard they rowed at that oar. So, as it relates to, what happened in August of this year in Kabul, okay, everybody gets a piece of that pie of responsibility. So I would throw that one on the table right up front. So what could security force assistance or the SFABs have done different? So I was there in 2018. I was the brigade commander for 1st SFAB when they deployed, the very first SFAB deployment. And what's significant about that is not the number first, right? It's the approach we took. So history lesson. In 2014, we withdrew advisors out of Afghanistan. We used to have advisors down to the battalion level in the Afghan army, right? And police battalions or their equivalent of it, right? Across the country. We pulled that force structure out as part of the reduction. And we pulled advisors up to the core headquarters level and the police province level, right? As well as maintaining a presence in Kabul. Right. That was still 2014. We started in 2014. It stayed that way till 2018. Part of the reason for putting SFABs into Afghanistan in 2018 was to reintroduce advisors down to the tactical level, down to the battalion level, right? And it goes back to my point about crisis. What that gave us was access and awareness, right? Top two things. And if you listen to General Milley when he testified in front of Congress 3 weeks ago, right? One of the things he talked about was the loss of awareness of what was going on across the country in the last months of our effort in Afghanistan. Why? Because as part of the force drawdown, all that force structure came out over the 2 preceding years, really, and really kind of precipitated in the last few months. And so you lost situational awareness of what was going on. And because you lost situational awareness of what was going on at the Afghan battalion level and below, you lost the ability to influence it, right? You lost the ability to ensure that soldiers got paid, right? You lost the ability to influence, to ensure that soldiers had uniforms and had food, right? All those things that maintain faith. And with faith comes the will to fight. So you can kind of see the logical chain of events, how this thing happens, right? It's not about, hey, we took the SFABs out of Afghanistan. That's a crock of a thesis, right? Because it's not just about one element or one team, right? Everybody gets a hand at rowing on their oar in this boat, and we have to keep that in mind all the time. But it's a natural order of events when you start to withdraw from a country and you lose awareness of what's going on when there lacks a strong state structure, right? It's not like, if you had a really developed country, right, with a strong state structure, you potentially could stay at the national level, and through those indigenous structures, maintain awareness of what was going on. But when a capital can't talk to a province and maintain situational awareness inside their own country, then our ability to do that's going to be obviously not effective, right? Does that help? Where'd you go? You disappeared on me. Oh, you're way over there. There you go. Is that good? All right.
And we'll grab him on the 13 characteristics afterwards.
Yeah, I'll just say, so here's a short answer. Here's the reasons I just wrote, right? Empathy, right? What's the difference between sympathy and empathy? Alan, it's a chance to redeem yourself, man. It's okay. Yeah. Thank you. You're a great cadet. You're awesome. Disregard what I said earlier, right? You're a winner, right? That's exactly it. Is empathy an Army value? Probably should be. It's part of being a good leader, but it's not an Army value, right? Is it captured in our leadership doctrine? Not currently, right? But if you're an advisor and don't have empathy, then you suck as an advisor, right? So that's just one example. Patience, flexibility, empathy, humility. I could go on and on, but we'll come back to that first.
So I think we only have time for one more question. So I'm gonna give this one from the virtual audience. This is from Lieutenant Colonel Augie Dominguez at OSD Policy. So how do SFABs integrate into combatant command and country team plans to nest with theater security cooperation plans?
Okay, try to nail some real quick. So a procedure question, right? So SFABs are aligned to each one of the geographic combatant commands. We have 1 brigade per GCC, right? They work for the Army Service Component Command, which in support of the geographic combatant commands drafts theater security cooperation plans, right? What we're going to do, what effect we're going to achieve, and what countries, when, and how, right? We execute. And so that's the lash up, right? I don't pick the countries. My brigade commanders don't pick the countries. The geographic combatant commander as an ASCC commander picks the countries. Now, how do they integrate with the embassies? Hand in glove, right? Each embassy, each ambassador has what's called an integrated country strategy, right? Which describes how that embassy, that mission team, country team, is going to achieve the United States' interest in that country. Our folks, again, work hand in glove with that. There's collateral and sympathetic or supplementary effects, I guess you'd say, between what the military does and what everybody else in the country team does as well. So I'm going to leave it at that. So maybe we can squeak one more in. Maybe that's not an SFAB question.
Squeak one more question in. I will. I'll do it just for time purposes, and I think this builds on what we were saying about Afghanistan. I'd love to hear just a little bit more about maybe from Dr. Joyce or Colonel Matisek. We often hear about to what extent is Afghanistan a problem of the differing interests or differing cultural values, differing ways of doing things that we were talking about earlier. I thought General Jackson would very well said on the shared responsibility, but I'd like to hear a little bit about this common explanation I hear for the failures of Afghanistan. I think we'll have to be very brief, otherwise Major Atwell is going to be mad at me.
I'll go first. And this actually piggybacks on what General Jackson was saying. So I was in Afghanistan down in Kandahar for most of 2020. His SFAB unit there was doing their job. They're doing their mission. But not every branch, again, takes advising seriously. I will give you an example. There was one Afghan unit at Kandahar Airfield. There was an advisor assigned to them. They had always gotten a pilot or air crew member assigned to this unit because it was the Afghan Scan Eagle drone unit in Kandahar. When I was there, they put in, for the first time ever, a Navy JAG lawyer reservist to advise the Afghans on how to do drone operations and flying. If you do not staff and fill these jobs with people that should be doing that job, you will not get the outcome. So when I met these Afghans and talked to them, it was very clear. They were frustrated that they were not being treated with any respect because they had always gotten a pilot to advise them on flying operations. And now they had a lawyer. He's a very nice guy. He admitted knew nothing about flying, and he was there. That's why it hurts me, and that's why I'm so passionate about this, is because I got to see it firsthand last year. SFABs are doing their job. Other branches do not take it very seriously, unfortunately. And I want to have every branch, the Joint Force, the Purple Force, whatever you want to call it, take this seriously, and we need to actually excel at it. It's not that hard, but we have to actually reward you for doing it. And it's not easy work.
I guess just maybe a concluding thought here. The saying comes to mind is success has many fathers, failure is an orphan, right? And so I do think that it is easy to blame SFA for what went wrong in Afghanistan. And I think, right, there's clearly limitations in the ability, visibility, monitoring, the way that the SFA was actually implemented. But really, I do think that this also speaks to these broader political problems and problems of alignments and interests. And so, right, this is a big conversation about, well, in an ideal world, you would pick partners in the first place who have values and interests that are aligned. Unfortunately, the places where the U.S. has found itself doing intensive counterinsurgency, support to counterinsurgency missions tend not to be places where it has, great partners in the first place, right? And so then what do you do, right? How do you actually try to align incentives and interests? And, I guess I'll just maybe conclude with a puzzle that I, coming from an academic perspective, am intrigued by, right? So there's been some criticism of the U.S. approach to SFA in Afghanistan, which was very ostensibly focused on, relationships and rapport building, as opposed to maybe, wielding carrots and sticks effectively to try and force interests into alignment. And, a puzzle in my mind is to say, okay, so maybe the U.S. emphasized relationships. Maybe it could have sort of wielded carrots and sticks more effectively. Maybe it didn't. But if we look back historically in the 1980s, right, the Soviets also tried to build competent fighting forces in Afghanistan. And they tried a very different approach than the U.S., right? Rapport and persuasion was not really in their vocabulary. It was a coercive, fairly brutal approach from my understanding of the case. And yet they also sort of failed pretty spectacularly. And so, I think that raises the question of why. I don't have a good answer for that, but I think that's a really interesting question. And I think that's worth considering as we sort of go forward and evaluate, what works and what doesn't in these particular kinds of SFA missions.
It's a great note to end on. It's a good point for anybody thinking about thesis topics for the future. A very rich area. So we've gone overtime, unsurprisingly, with such great panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to keep an eye out on at the IWI website for more great work on this topic. I believe we have some cadets here to present you with some tokens of our appreciation for joining us here.
We're getting some swag. That's what I'm talking about.
Nice. So
schmugs.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well done.
Thanks a lot.
Good question on the beaver. Good answer.
Squirrel. I need the squirrel. Squirrel.
Yeah. yeah, so I believe that ends the evening. Thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming. Thanks to everybody online for joining us. And for those of you who are here, I believe we will be able to stick around for a few minutes if you do have any burning questions.
Come get some.
This is off. Could you talk about Okay. Before you leave, this is off too. Or is it off? Can you please just handle your trash? The staff and faculty here have to set up